What would life look like after surviving one of the most horrifying abduction cases in modern American history? For 18 years, the world had no idea where Jaycee Dugard was. One moment, she was an ordinary 11-year-old girl walking to her school bus stop in rural California. The next, she vanished in broad daylight without a trace. No warning. No witnesses who could stop it. And almost no clues pointing investigators toward where she had gone. As days turned into months, and months into years, hope slowly began to fade. Her devastated family never stopped searching. Investigators chased dead ends across multiple states. Her face appeared on television specials, missing person posters, and national news reports as millions followed the mystery surrounding the little girl who seemed to disappear into thin air. But behind the walls of a hidden backyard compound, a terrifying secret was unfolding. For nearly 2 decades, Jaycee was held captive by convicted sex offender Phillip Garrido and his wife, Nancy Garrido, isolated from society, while the outside world believed she might never be found alive. During those lost years, Jaycee became a mother to 2 daughters born in captivity. She lived under constant control, fear, and manipulation while trying to protect the children growing up beside her in unimaginable circumstances. Then, in 2009, everything changed. A strange encounter on a university campus in California suddenly raised suspicions. What began as a routine conversation quickly unraveled into one of the most shocking discoveries law enforcement had ever seen. The missing girl America had searched for since 1990. One was standing right there in front of them. Alive. The revelation stunned the entire country. But while the rescue made international headlines, far fewer people know what happened afterward. How do you rebuild a life after spending 18 years hidden away from the world? What happened to the daughters Jaycee raised during captivity? Where is she now, 35 years after the abduction that shocked America? And how did she transform unimaginable trauma into a quiet life centered around healing, family, and survival? Today, we're taking a closer look inside Jaycee Dugard's life after captivity. From the horrifying years she endured in secrecy to the remarkable resilience that helped her reclaim her future. Because while many remember the crime itself, the story that followed may be even more extraordinary. And some parts of her journey are far more surprising than most people realize. Before the world knew her name, before headlines and documentaries and courtroom testimony, Jaycee Dugard was simply a little girl growing up in a quiet California town. A child who loved animals, spent time riding bikes with friends, and lived an ordinary life surrounded by family who cared deeply for her. Born in 1980, Jaycee spent much of her childhood in Northern California. Friends and relatives would later describe her as energetic, kind-hearted, and imaginative. She shared a particularly close bond with her mother, Terry Probin, who worked hard to provide stability for her daughter. Jaycee was also close with her stepfather, Carl Probin, who became a major father figure in her life after marrying Terry. Their family life wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with routines that felt safe and familiar. School mornings, bus rides, dinners together, the kind of ordinary moments no one imagines can suddenly disappear forever. And then came June 10, 1991. It was a warm Monday morning in the small community of Mayors, near South Lake Tahoe, California. 11-year-old Jaycee prepared for school like she had many times before. She walked toward the bus stop near her home, carrying her books and expecting another normal day. But within seconds, everything changed. As Jaycee stood near the roadside, a gray car suddenly pulled up beside her. Witnesses later said a man grabbed her violently and forced her into the vehicle while a woman sat inside the car. The abduction happened in broad daylight, terrifyingly fast, horrifyingly public. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was that there were witnesses. Carl Probin, Jaycee's stepfather, was outside the home at the time and reportedly saw part of the attack unfold from a distance while chasing after the vehicle on a bicycle. Neighbors also noticed the suspicious car speeding away. Panic spread almost immediately through the quiet neighborhood as family members realized Jaycee had been taken. Imagine the horror of watching someone disappear in front of you and being powerless to stop it. Within hours, local police launched a desperate search effort. Officers canvassed the area surrounding the bus stop, interviewed neighbors, and searched nearby woods and roads. Missing posters quickly appeared across California. Volunteers joined search parties. Helicopters scanned remote terrain. Authorities hoped the child had been abandoned nearby. But no trace of Jaycee was found. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation intensified. Detectives pursued every possible lead: suspicious sightings, tips from strangers, reported vehicle matches, and potential suspects. Yet the case kept hitting dead ends. The disappearance soon exploded into national news coverage. Television stations across America aired Jaycee's school photos repeatedly. Newspapers printed heartbreaking stories about the missing 11-year-old whose family refused to give up hope. Her face became painfully familiar to millions of Americans during the early 1990s, joining the growing list of missing children whose cases dominated public attention. For Jaycee's mother, the emotional devastation was overwhelming. Terry Probin later spoke openly about the unbearable grief and guilt she carried after the abduction. Every passing birthday became another painful reminder of lost time. Holidays were especially difficult. The family constantly wondered whether Jaycee was alive, whether she was suffering, or whether they would ever see her again. And perhaps the cruelest part of missing child cases is the uncertainty. There is no funeral, no final goodbye. Families remain trapped between hope and heartbreak, often for years. Investigators worked tirelessly, but the case became increasingly frustrating. Tips poured in from across the country, many of them false. Reported sightings of Jaycee emerged in different states. Psychics claimed to know where she was. Suspects were questioned and later cleared. At times, investigators believed they were close to solving the case, only for critical leads to collapse. As months became years, media attention slowly faded. New cases replaced old headlines. Search efforts became less frequent. Public awareness declined. For many outside the family, Jaycee Dugard's disappearance became another tragic mystery from the past. But her loved ones refused to completely lose hope. Terry continued speaking publicly about her daughter for years, keeping Jaycee's memory alive even as optimism became harder to hold on to. Family members clung to the possibility that somehow, somewhere, Jaycee might still be alive. What they could not have imagined was that, while the world believed Jaycee was likely gone forever, she was actually living in captivity only a few hours away. And the truth about where she had been, and what she had endured, would eventually shock the entire country. For nearly 18 years after her abduction in 1991, Jaycee Dugard lived in conditions almost impossible for most people to comprehend. Hidden behind fences, sheds, and makeshift tents on a property in Antioch, she existed in a world deliberately cut off from normal society, a world controlled almost entirely by Phillip Garrido and his wife, Nancy Garrido. What made the situation even more disturbing was how ordinary the neighborhood appeared from the outside. Families lived nearby. Children played in surrounding streets. People passed the house every day without realizing that a kidnapped young woman and eventually 2 children were being hidden just beyond view. At first, Jaycee's captivity was defined by fear, confusion, and isolation. She had been taken at only 11 years old, still emotionally a child, and suddenly forced into an environment where every aspect of her life was controlled. Over time, the isolation became one of the most powerful tools used against her. The longer she remained separated from the outside world, the harder it became to imagine escape or believe rescue was even possible. Psychological manipulation played a massive role in how the Garridos maintained control. Phillip Garrido reportedly created an atmosphere where fear and dependency became intertwined. Jaycee was repeatedly told that authorities would not help her, that escape was dangerous, and that cooperating was the safest option. Over years of captivity, this type of manipulation, can fundamentally reshape a victim's sense of reality. And while the physical confinement was horrifying, the emotional captivity became equally powerful. As years passed, Jaycee was forced to adapt in order to survive emotionally. Survival often meant learning how to manage fear day by day, avoiding conflict when possible, and focusing on small moments of stability. Many experts who later examined the case explained that long-term captivity victims frequently develop coping mechanisms that outsiders may struggle to understand. These strategies are not signs of weakness. They are survival responses developed under extreme trauma. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Jaycee's story is that she became a mother while still being held captive. During those hidden years, she gave birth to 2 daughters, raising them inside the isolated compound while trying to shield them from the terrifying reality surrounding them. Despite the unimaginable circumstances, Jaycee reportedly worked constantly to protect her children emotionally. She attempted to create routines, moments of comfort, and a sense of normalcy inside an environment that was anything but normal. In many ways, motherhood became one of the strongest forces keeping her emotionally grounded. But the emotional dynamics inside captivity were deeply complicated. The children reportedly knew Phillip Garrido as a father figure, while Jaycee herself had spent so many years under manipulation and control that everyday interactions inside the compound became psychologically layered and confusing. Trauma experts later noted that prolonged captivity can blur emotional boundaries in ways difficult for outsiders to fully understand. Victims often learn behaviors centered around survival, compliance, and minimizing danger. At the same time, Jaycee never completely lost the part of herself that wanted freedom. Even during isolation, she reportedly maintained private hopes that one day life could change. That quiet resilience would ultimately become one of the defining elements of her survival story. What also stunned the public after the case was uncovered was how long the captivity continued without intervention. Neighbors occasionally noticed unusual activity on the property: tents, children in the backyard, people moving around behind fences, but few imagined the truth. Some later recalled hearing strange noises or seeing behavior that seemed unusual, yet no one understood the full reality hidden there. The case also raised painful questions about law enforcement oversight and missed warning signs. Years before Jaycee was finally discovered, Phillip Garrido had already been a registered sex offender with a criminal history involving kidnapping and sexual violence. Reports later revealed that parole officers and authorities had visited the property at various times. Critics questioned how a convicted offender under supervision could maintain such a hidden compound for years without the situation being uncovered. Those questions became even more serious after revelations that witnesses had occasionally raised concerns about children being seen on the property. For many people following the case, this became one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking aspects of the story: the sense that opportunities may have existed to discover the truth earlier. Yet through all of it, what continues to stand out most is Jaycee Dugard's extraordinary emotional endurance. She entered captivity as a child, spent nearly 2 decades isolated from the world, endured psychological control and trauma, and still managed to protect her daughters, preserve part of her identity, and eventually reclaim her freedom. Her survival required a level of resilience that few people can truly imagine. And after 18 hidden years, the moment that would finally change everything was approaching. For nearly 2 decades, the disappearance of Jaycee Dugard remained one of America's most heartbreaking unsolved missing child cases. Investigators had chased leads for years. Age-progressed photos had circulated across television screens and newspapers. Her family never stopped hopping. But by 2009, few could imagine that Jaycee was still alive, hidden in plain sight only miles away from everyday suburban life. And then, everything changed because of a single encounter that initially seemed routine. In August 2009, Phillip Garrido arrived at the campus of University of California, Berkeley, accompanied by 2 young girls and a woman. Garrido had permission to visit the campus for an event connected to one of his unusual religious and motivational speaking interests. But something about the interaction immediately unsettled staff members. Witnesses later described Garrido's behavior as erratic, overly intense, and deeply concerning. The girls with him appeared nervous and withdrawn. The woman standing nearby barely spoke. Campus employees contacted authorities after feeling that the situation simply did not seem right. That decision would become the turning point that ended an 18-year nightmare. Because Garrido was already a registered sex offender and parolee with a long criminal history, parole officers were alerted and instructed to question him further. When officers met with Garrido again, they quickly noticed inconsistencies in his explanations. He struggled to clearly identify the young girls. His stories changed repeatedly. The woman with him seemed terrified and emotionally detached. Experienced parole officers later admitted they sensed something deeply wrong almost immediately. As questioning intensified, the woman eventually revealed the truth that shocked everyone in the room. She quietly told investigators her name was Jaycee Dugard. For a moment, authorities reportedly struggled to process what they were hearing. The little girl abducted in 1991, the child whose face had appeared on missing posters across America, was standing directly in front of them as a grown woman. The revelation stunned law enforcement officials. After 18 years of uncertainty, mystery, and grief, the impossible had happened. Jaycee Dugard had been found alive. The emotional impact on her family was overwhelming. Back in California, Jaycee's mother had spent nearly 2 decades living with unanswered questions and unimaginable pain. There had always been hope somewhere deep inside her, but hope had been constantly shadowed by fear. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Authorities informed the family that Jaycee was alive. It is difficult to fully imagine the emotional weight of that moment. A mother who had spent 18 years mourning the loss of her daughter suddenly learned that the child she thought she might never see again was coming home. Reports described tears, disbelief, shock, and overwhelming relief flooding the family all at once. For viewers watching around the world, the story felt almost unreal. Within hours, news organizations across America interrupted regular programming to cover the rescue. Major international networks rapidly picked up the story. Newspapers printed enormous headlines announcing that one of the nation's most famous missing children had been found alive after nearly 2 decades in captivity. People across the country became emotionally invested in Jaycee's survival story overnight. But alongside the relief came heartbreak. The details emerging about her captivity were devastating. Investigators learned that Jaycee had spent years hidden inside a secret backyard compound behind Garrido's home. She had lived in isolation, separated from normal society during her entire adolescence and early adulthood. Even more shocking to the public was the revelation that Jaycee was not alone. She had 2 daughters. The girls, who had spent their entire lives inside captivity, suddenly became part of an international media storm they could not possibly understand. The public immediately began asking difficult questions. How much did the children know? Had they ever attended school? How would they adapt to normal life? What emotional trauma had they endured growing up in isolation? For Jaycee, the rescue marked the end of captivity, but also the beginning of an entirely different struggle. Reintegration into society after 18 years was unimaginably complex. Everyday experiences most people take for granted suddenly became overwhelming. Technology had transformed dramatically since 1991. Entire cultural eras had passed, while Jaycee remained hidden from the world. She had missed childhood, adolescence, major life milestones, and nearly 2 decades of ordinary human experiences. Psychologists and trauma experts quickly explained that recovery from prolonged captivity is not something that happens overnight. Freedom itself can feel frightening after years of control and isolation. Jaycee now faced enormous emotional challenges: rebuilding trust, reconnecting with family, adjusting to public attention, and helping her daughters navigate a world they had never truly experienced before. At the same time, her family also faced a painful emotional adjustment. The daughter they remembered as an 11-year-old child was now an adult woman carrying unimaginable trauma and responsibilities. Rebuilding those relationships required patience, understanding, and emotional healing on all sides. Yet despite the heartbreak, the reunion carried extraordinary hope. Against all odds, Jaycee Dugard had survived. And after 18 years of darkness, she was finally home. After the shocking rescue that reunited Jaycee Dugard with her family after 18 years in captivity, many people expected her to immediately become a permanent public figure. News networks across America desperately wanted interviews. Talk shows competed for exclusive appearances. Millions of people were fascinated by the unbelievable story of the young girl who had vanished in 1991 and somehow survived nearly 2 decades hidden from the world. But Jaycee made a very different decision. Instead of embracing constant media attention, she chose privacy. For someone who had spent most of her life being controlled, watched, and manipulated, protecting her freedom became one of the most important parts of healing. She avoided the spotlight whenever possible and focused almost entirely on rebuilding a safe and stable life for herself, and most importantly, for her 2 daughters. The transition into normal life was overwhelming in ways most people could never imagine. Jaycee had entered captivity as an 11-year-old child living in a completely different world. By the time she was rescued, technology, culture, and society had dramatically changed. Cell phones, social media, and modern internet culture barely existed when she disappeared. Suddenly, she was expected to navigate a world she no longer recognized while also carrying unimaginable emotional trauma. And beyond all of that, she had become globally known overnight. Every headline carried her name. Every television station discussed her story. Strangers debated her trauma publicly while she was still trying to process what freedom even meant. For many survivors of long-term abuse, regaining a sense of personal control becomes essential, and Jaycee understood that immediately. That is why she carefully limited interviews and public appearances during the early years after her rescue. Instead, much of her energy went into therapy and emotional recovery. Experts have often explained that survivors of prolonged captivity face layers of trauma that can take years, sometimes decades, to fully process. Jaycee had experienced isolation, fear, manipulation, and psychological conditioning throughout most of her adolescence and adulthood. Healing from that kind of abuse is not a single moment. It is an ongoing process. Reports later revealed that therapy played a major role in helping Jaycee and her daughters adjust to life outside the compound. The emotional challenges were enormous. Her daughters had been raised in near-total isolation and suddenly had to adapt to schools, friendships, public attention, and an entirely unfamiliar society. At the same time, Jaycee herself had to rediscover her own identity. For years, her captor had controlled almost every aspect of her life. After the rescue, she finally had the chance to make her own decisions again: what she wanted to wear, where she wanted to live, who she wanted to trust, and how she wanted to tell her story. That journey toward independence became one of the most powerful chapters of her recovery. In 2011, Jaycee made the difficult decision to publicly share her experiences through her memoir, A Stolen Life. The book offered readers a heartbreaking but deeply personal look into her years in captivity, her emotional survival, and the complicated psychological realities of abuse. For many readers, the memoir was incredibly emotional because Jaycee did not write from a place of revenge alone. She wrote honestly about fear, confusion, survival, motherhood, and resilience. Her willingness to speak openly helped people better understand how trauma can reshape a person's entire world. The memoir quickly became widely discussed across the country and introduced millions of readers to the human side of the case beyond the headlines. Jaycee later participated in several carefully selected interviews with major media outlets, including conversations with Diane Sawyer and other high-profile journalists. During those appearances, viewers were struck not only by her courage, but also by her calmness, compassion, and emotional strength. Many expected anger to define her. Instead, what stood out most was her determination to move forward. That resilience inspired countless survivors of trauma around the world. People who had experienced abuse, kidnapping, violence, or emotional manipulation often said Jaycee's story gave them hope that recovery was possible, even after unimaginable suffering. But Jaycee wanted her survival to mean more than public sympathy. She wanted to help others. That goal eventually led to the creation of the Jaycee Foundation, an organization focused on supporting individuals and families affected by trauma. Through the foundation, Jaycee has advocated for mental health support, education, and resources for survivors and families dealing with crisis situations. The foundation's work reflects something deeply important about Jaycee's journey. She refused to let her entire identity remain tied to what happened to her. Instead, she focused on what she could build afterward. Over the years, Jaycee has continued trying to reclaim privacy and independence while still using her voice in meaningful ways. Unlike many public figures connected to major criminal cases, she has consistently protected her personal life and her daughters from unnecessary public exposure. That balance, speaking out while still protecting her peace, has become a defining part of her recovery story. And perhaps that is what makes Jaycee Dugard's journey so powerful. Her story is not only about surviving captivity. It is about rebuilding a life afterward. It is about learning how to trust again after betrayal, how to heal after years of fear, and how to create hope after unimaginable darkness. For millions of people who followed her story, that may be the most inspiring chapter of all. Even after becoming the center of one of the most shocking kidnapping cases in modern American history, Jaycee Dugard has spent much of her life since rescue trying to do something very simple: live quietly. Today, Jaycee remains largely out of the public spotlight. Unlike many people thrust into worldwide fame after tragedy, she has consistently chosen privacy over celebrity. Reports over the years suggest she focuses heavily on family life, emotional healing, and maintaining a sense of normalcy that was stolen from her for so many years. For someone whose childhood and identity were controlled for nearly 2 decades, protecting that peace appears to have become deeply important. One of the most meaningful parts of Jaycee's life today is her relationship with her daughters, who were born during her captivity. As the girls grew older and became adults themselves, Jaycee reportedly worked hard to create a stable and loving environment far removed from the isolation they once experienced. While the family rarely speaks publicly in detail, many observers have noted the remarkable strength it likely took to rebuild those bonds in the outside world, while simultaneously processing years of trauma together. People close to the case have often described Jaycee as extremely careful about public appearances. She does not frequently give interviews, attend media events, or share details about her personal life online. When she does appear publicly, it is usually connected to causes she deeply believes in, especially advocacy for trauma survivors, child protection, and recovery support. That selective approach has helped her maintain control over her own story, after spending so many years without control over anything at all. Jaycee has also continued writing and speaking about survival and healing on her own terms. Her memoir, A Stolen Life, gave the world a heartbreaking first-hand account of captivity, while later works focused more on resilience, recovery, and reclaiming identity after trauma. Rather than sensationalizing her experience, her writing has often emphasized emotional survival, adaptation, and the long road toward rebuilding a life. And even decades later, the emotional impact of captivity never fully disappears. Experts who work with trauma survivors frequently explain that recovery from long-term abuse is not something with a clear finish line. Survivors may continue dealing with anxiety, trust issues, hypervigilance, grief, and emotional triggers for years, sometimes for life. Jaycee's journey has helped many people better understand that survival is not only about escaping danger. It is also about learning how to exist again afterward. That is one reason the public remains so fascinated by her story. For many people, Jaycee became more than a missing child found alive. She became a symbol of endurance under unimaginable circumstances. The fact that she survived 18 years of isolation and manipulation, while still managing to protect and raise her daughters, continues to leave people stunned even today. Her case also changed broader conversations surrounding missing children investigations and trauma-informed recovery. Law enforcement agencies, psychologists, victim advocates, and media organizations all faced new questions after her rescue. How should survivors of long-term captivity be reintegrated into society? What kind of mental health support is necessary? How can authorities better recognize manipulation and coercive control? Jaycee's story forced many institutions to confront those issues more seriously. For survivors of abuse and trauma, Jaycee's quiet resilience has become especially meaningful. Many survivors have said they admire not only the fact that she endured captivity, but the way she chose to move forward afterward, slowly, privately, and carefully. She never appeared interested in becoming a public spectacle. Instead, she focused on healing, family, and reclaiming ownership of her life piece by piece. And perhaps that quiet strength is what continues to resonate most strongly. Not because her life suddenly became easy after rescue. Not because trauma simply disappeared. But because, despite everything taken from her, Jaycee Dugard continued forward anyway. Over the years, she has shown the world that resilience does not always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like protecting your peace, raising your children, setting boundaries, choosing privacy, continuing to heal long after headlines fade away. 35 years after her abduction, Jaycee Dugard's story remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories in modern history. What began as a tragedy that shocked the nation eventually became a powerful example of resilience, healing, and determination. For 18 years, the world had no idea where Jaycee was or whether she would ever be found. Yet against unimaginable odds, she survived. And after finally regaining her freedom, she faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a life that had been stolen from her for nearly 2 decades. In the years since her rescue, Jaycee has worked hard to create a quieter and more peaceful life away from constant public attention. Rather than allowing her past to define her completely, she focused on healing, protecting her daughters, and finding stability after years of trauma. Although the emotional scars of captivity never fully disappear, many people have been inspired by the strength she has shown while learning how to move forward. Her story also changed the way many people think about trauma and recovery. Experts, advocates, and survivors have pointed to Jaycee's experience as an important reminder that healing is often a long and deeply personal process. Through her memoirs, interviews, and advocacy efforts, she helped bring greater awareness to the lasting effects of abuse, captivity, and psychological manipulation, while also giving hope to other survivors facing unimaginable pain. For many people around the world, Jaycee Dugard's journey is not only about surviving a horrific crime. It is about reclaiming identity, rebuilding family, and discovering that hope can still exist after years of darkness. Even today, public fascination with her story continues because it represents both tragedy and resilience in one of the most powerful ways imaginable. And while Jaycee now chooses to live largely outside the spotlight, the impact of her story continues to resonate decades later. Her strength, courage, and determination remain an inspiration to countless people who have followed her journey over the years. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.